In June 1941, the German Wehrmacht was the master of modern warfare. Their doctrine, Blitzkrieg, relied on speed, radio coordination, and the precision of the dive bomber. Artillery, in the German view, was a support weapon. It was meant to suppress the enemy while the tanks broke through. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they examined the Red Army's artillery arm and found it wanting. German intelligence officers noted that Soviet communications were primitive. They lacked radios. Most orders were given by telephone wire, easily cut, or signal flags. They noted that Soviet gun crews were often poorly educated peasants who struggled with complex ballistics calculations. They saw that the Soviets relied heavily on horses to move their guns, while the Germans, at least in the panzer divisions, used half-tracks. The German General Staff dismissed the Soviet artillery as a blunt instrument. They believed it was too slow to react to the fluid nature of modern mobile warfare. The Russian cannon is dangerous, a German report might read, but it is blind and deaf. They believed they could simply drive around the Soviet gun batteries, encircle them, and destroy them from the rear before they could turn around. And for the first year of the war, this assessment seemed correct. Thousands of Soviet guns were overrun and captured in the great encirclements of Kiev and Minsk. The German officers would inspect the captured pieces, rugged, rough-cast steel, lacking the fine finish of a Krupp gun, and sneer. They thought they were fighting a 19th-century army that had stumbled into the 20th century. They didn't realize that the blunt instrument was exactly what the Soviets intended to build. They didn't understand the Soviet philosophy of war. The Germans wanted to fence with a rapier. The Soviets were building a sledgehammer the size of a mountain. And while the Germans were laughing at the lack of radios, the Soviets were busy casting enough steel to blot out the sun. Joseph Stalin was a brutal dictator, but he understood one thing perfectly: the power of the gun. He famously called artillery the god of war. While the Germans were obsessing over complex, high-tech tanks like the Tiger, Stalin ordered his industries to focus on tubes. Simple, reliable, mass-produced artillery pieces. The Soviet industrial machine, moved behind the Urals to escape the German advance, began to churn out guns on a scale that defied imagination. They didn't build them like Swiss watches. They built them like farm equipment. They reduced the number of parts. They loosened the tolerances. They accepted rough welds. But the guns shot straight, and they didn't jam in the mud. The Soviet doctrine was based on a simple mathematical principle: mass. If you cannot aim precisely because you lack radios and skilled observers, you simply fire at everything. If you can't hit a specific bunker with one shell, you fire 1,000 shells at the general grid square. The law of averages guarantees the bunker will be destroyed. This philosophy terrified the German strategists because it didn't rely on skill. It relied on industrial output. And the Soviet output was terrifying. By 1942, while Germany was struggling to replace its losses, the Red Army was forming entire artillery divisions and artillery corps. These were units that contained no infantry and no tanks, just thousands of guns. They were mobile reservoirs of firepower that the High Command could plug into any sector of the front. The Germans were fighting a tactical war, trying to outmaneuver the enemy. The Soviets were preparing to fight a mathematical war, where the variable was the number of high-explosive shells per square meter of German-occupied Earth. Stalin's god was hungry, and he was about to be fed. If there was one weapon that symbolized the Soviet artillery revolution, it was the 76mm divisional gun M1942, ZS-3. It was the most produced artillery piece of World War II. Over 103,000 were built. For comparison, Germany built only about 20,000 of their equivalent Pak-40s. The ZS-3 was a masterpiece of simplicity. It was designed by Vasily Grabin, a genius who ignored the bureaucratic orders to stop development and built it in secret. It was light enough to be pushed by its crew or towed by a jeep or a Studebaker truck. It had a low silhouette, making it easy to hide. But its greatest asset was its versatility. It could be used as a standard howitzer, firing high-explosive shells over hills at invisible targets. But it could also be used as a direct-fire anti-tank gun. Its high-velocity shell could punch through the armor of the Panzer III and IV. German infantrymen hated this gun. They gave it a nickname, the Ratschbum. Why? Because the shell traveled faster than the speed of sound. You heard the ratch, the tearing sound of the shell passing you, before you heard the bum, the sound of the gun firing. If you heard the ratch, you were already alive. If you didn't hear it, you were dead. The ZS-3 was everywhere. Every Soviet infantry regiment had them. They were dragged through swamps, lifted up mountains, and hidden in forests. The German commanders, who relied on specialized guns for specialized roles, anti-tank guns versus howitzers, were bewildered by this universal weapon. They would attack a Soviet infantry position expecting only rifles, and suddenly find themselves under fire from high-velocity artillery. The ZS-3 was cheap, ugly, and effective. It was the AK-47 of artillery pieces, a weapon for the masses that changed the balance of power. The most terrifying innovation of Soviet artillery tactics was the use of direct fire. In Western armies, American, British, German, heavy artillery sat miles behind the front lines. Observers called in coordinates, and the guns fired over the heads of the infantry. It was a remote, scientific process. The Soviets changed the rules. They believed that the most accurate way to hit a target was to look right at it. They rolled their heavy guns, the 76mm ZS-3, the 122mm howitzers, even the massive 152mm guns, right up to the front trenches. This was suicidal bravery. The gun crews were exposed to German machine gun fire and snipers. They were often only 200 or 300 meters from the enemy. They looked through the open sights of their massive cannons, aiming them like giant rifles. They targeted specific bunkers, machine gun nests, and tank turrets. The effect on the German defenders was psychologically devastating. Imagine being a German soldier in a pillbox. You are used to artillery falling from the sky. You have cover overhead. Suddenly, you look out your firing slit and see a 152mm howitzer barrel pointing directly at your face from across the field. There is no time to call for help. There is no time to run. Boom! The bunker is vaporized. This tactic, firing over open sights, allowed the Soviets to crack the German defensive lines with surgical violence. It negated the German advantage in fortification. No concrete was thick enough to stop a heavy shell fired from point-blank range. The German commanders called it barbaric. They thought it was a waste of expensive artillery pieces to use them as frontline weapons. But the Soviets didn't care about the cost. They cared about the breakthrough. By wheeling the god of war into the front trench, they forced the Wehrmacht into a staring contest with the biggest guns on Earth. And the Wehrmacht blinked. If the standard artillery was the hammer, the BM-13 Katyusha was the scream. The Germans had their own rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer. It was a precision weapon, firing 6 rockets from a towed carriage. The Soviet Katyusha was different. It was a truck, usually a Lend-Lease Studebaker, with a rack of steel rails bolted to the back. It fired 16 132mm rockets in about 10 seconds. When a battery of 4 trucks fired, they unleashed 64 heavy rockets in a single ripple. The Germans called it Stalin's organ because the launch rails looked like the pipes of a church organ, and the sound was ungodly. It wasn't a boom. It was a terrifying, grinding shriek. WHEEE. For the German soldier huddled in a foxhole, that sound triggered a primal panic. The rockets were not accurate. They wobbled in flight. They landed all over the grid square. But that was the point. The Katyusha wasn't designed to hit a specific tank. It was designed to erase an area. The warheads were filled with high explosives that created a massive overpressure wave and thousands of red-hot shrapnel fragments. When a salvo hit a German assembly area, it didn't just kill men, it shredded trucks, ignited fuel, and stunned the survivors into catatonia. The psychological impact was arguably greater than the physical damage. German prisoners captured after a Katyusha strike were often found shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak. The German High Command had initially dismissed rockets as imprecise and wasteful. They believed in aimed fire. But they didn't account for the mobility of the Katyusha. The Soviet crews practiced shoot and scoot tactics. They would drive to a firing position, launch their rockets in seconds, and drive away before the smoke cleared. The German counter-battery fire would land on empty ground. The Katyusha batteries were the fire brigades of the Red Army. They raced up and down the front, plugging gaps and shattering German attacks before they could gain momentum. The Germans tried to copy it, the Panzerwerfer, but they never matched the sheer scale of the Soviet rocket divisions. The primitive weapon that couldn't hit a barn door turned out to be the most efficient way to break the nerve of the Wehrmacht. November 19, 1942. Operation Uranus. This was the moment the god of war woke up. For months, the Germans had been grinding their way into the ruins of Stalingrad, fighting block by block. They were focused on the city. They ignored the flanks, which were guarded by Romanian troops. The Soviets, under General Zhukov, had secretly massed an artillery force of biblical proportions on those flanks. Over 3,500 guns and mortars were brought up in total secrecy. They were hidden in ravines, covered in camouflage nets, and moved only at night. At 7:20 a.m., in the freezing fog of the Russian steppe, the order was given. Ogun! Fire! The horizon turned orange. The barrage didn't last for days, like in World War I. It lasted for 80 minutes. It was a hurricane of steel. The Romanian defensive line simply evaporated. Bunkers collapsed. Trenches were filled with earth. Wire obstacles were blown away. The German officers in the rear heard the rumble, a continuous, deep thunder that didn't stop. They thought it was a thunderstorm. Then they realized it was winter. The Soviet artillery had achieved saturation. They weren't aiming at targets, they were aiming at the map. When the barrage lifted, the Soviet tanks rolled forward. They didn't face a cohesive defense. They faced stunned, deafened survivors who surrendered immediately. The artillery had opened the gate. Within days, the Soviet pincers met at Kalach, trapping the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. General Paulus, the German commander, found himself surrounded not just by infantry, but by a ring of iron. The Soviet artillery moved in closer, tightening the noose. They began to pound the German pocket from all sides. The Kessel, cauldron, became a killing ground. The German strategists had mocked the Soviet lack of radios. But at Stalingrad, the Soviets proved they didn't need radios to coordinate complex maneuvers. They just needed a timetable and enough shells to bury the enemy alive. Operation Uranus was the masterclass of the artillery offensive. It proved that massed guns could dictate the strategic outcome of the entire war. As the Red Army pushed west into the cities of Europe, Budapest, Königsberg, Berlin, they encountered heavy fortifications. The Germans turned stone buildings into fortresses. Standard field guns bounced off the thick masonry. The Soviets brought up the sledgehammer. The 203mm howitzer model 1931 B4. It was a monster. It weighed 17 tons. Uniquely, it didn't have wheels. It sat on a tracked carriage, like a tank chassis, to support its immense weight and recoil. It looked like a piece of industrial machinery from a nightmare. The German soldiers called it Stalin's sledgehammer. In urban combat, the Soviets used it for direct fire. They would tow the B4 down a city street, right into the line of fire. They would lower the massive barrel until it was horizontal. At a range of 200 yards, they would fire a 200-pound concrete-piercing shell into a building. The effect was absolute. The shell didn't just make a hole, it brought the building down. Entire apartment blocks collapsed into rubble, burying the German defenders inside. It was siege warfare at point-blank range. The German commanders were horrified. They considered this use of heavy artillery uncivilized and clumsy. "They are using a sledgehammer to crack a nut," they sneered. But the nut cracked. The B4 cleared the way for the infantry. In the Battle of Berlin, the B4s were lined up to blast the heavy flak towers and the thick walls of the government district. There was no defense against it. You couldn't hide. You couldn't dig deep enough. The sledgehammer was the ultimate expression of the Soviet refusal to be stopped by obstacles. If a building was in the way, they didn't go around it. They removed it from the skyline. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk. The Germans planned a massive offensive with their new Tiger and Panther tanks. They expected to punch through the Soviet lines with heavy armor. But the Soviets knew they were coming. General Rokossovsky prepared a defensive trap based on artillery density. He packed the front lines with anti-tank guns, up to 20 guns per kilometer. But the real killer was the indirect fire. When the German panzers attacked, they ran into a wall of fire. The Soviet artillery observers practiced a technique called the rolling barrage, but used defensively. As the German tanks advanced, a curtain of explosions would drop in front of them. It stripped the German infantry away from the tanks. A tank without infantry is blind and vulnerable. The German tanks would push through the smoke, only to find themselves isolated. Then, the Soviet artillery would shift to barrier fire. They would shell the ground behind the German tanks, cutting off their retreat and preventing reinforcements from joining them. The German tanks were trapped in a box of explosions. Inside that box, the Soviet anti-tank gunners, the ZS-3 crews, went to work. The German commanders watched their elite panzer divisions dissolve. They radioed for counter-battery fire, but the Soviet guns were dug in deep, protected by log bunkers. The volume of fire was so intense that German tank crews reported their optics being shattered by the concussions. Tracks were blown off by near misses. The blitzkrieg, the doctrine of fast movement, died at Kursk. It died because you cannot move fast through a solid wall of high explosives. The German strategists had believed that armor could overcome firepower. The Soviets proved that if you have enough firepower, armor is just a slower way to die. At Kursk, the god of war didn't just support the army, he defended it. By the summer of 1944, the German High Command knew that Soviet artillery was dangerous. But they still clung to the belief that it was clumsy. They believed that well-entrenched German infantry, protected by deep bunkers and intricate trench systems, could weather the storm. Then came Operation Barbarossa, the destruction of Army Group Center in Russia. The Soviets introduced the world to a new concept, superdensity. Marshal Zhukov and his artillery commanders stopped thinking in terms of batteries or battalions. They thought in terms of geology. They massed guns on a scale that had never been seen in human history, and likely never will be again. In the breakthrough sectors, the Red Army concentrated up to 300 guns and heavy mortars per kilometer of front. Think about that. A kilometer is 1,000 meters. That means there was a heavy gun positioned every 3 meters. They were parked wheel to wheel, hub to hub, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a landscape of barrels. The logistical effort to feed these guns was immense. Millions of shells were stockpiled in the forests behind the lines. When the order to fire was given on June 22, 1944, the result was not a bombardment. It was terrain modification. The German defensive lines didn't just buckle, they ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Barbed wire was vaporized. Minefields were detonated en masse. The German bunkers, which had been lovingly constructed according to the best engineering principles, were simply buried under mountains of churned earth. A German general, whose division was on the receiving end, later wrote that it felt like the earth itself was opening up to swallow them. Entire German regiments vanished from the map in the first hour. The German strategists had mocked the primitive Soviets. But the Soviets had turned artillery into an industrial process of erasure. They didn't need to outthink the German soldier in the trench. They just needed to drop enough high explosives on his grid square to ensure that nothing biological could survive. We talk about tactics and strategy. But what was it like to be on the receiving end of the god of war? For the average Lanzer, German soldier, in 1944 or 1945, a Soviet artillery preparation was a glimpse of hell. The first thing was the noise. When thousands of guns fire simultaneously, the individual booms merge into a single, continuous roar. It was called Trommelfeuer, drum fire. But that doesn't do it justice. It was a physical pressure wave that compressed the chest and ruptured eardrums. The ground shook violently, continuously, for hours. Men in deep bunkers felt the walls vibrating. Dust choked the air. Candles were blown out by the concussions. You couldn't hear orders. You couldn't think. The psychological impact was devastating. Veteran German soldiers, men who had survived years of combat, would break down. They would curl into fetal positions, weeping uncontrollably. Some went mad. They would run out of their bunkers into the open, just to escape the claustrophobic terror of being buried alive. The Soviets knew this. They designed their barrages to break the enemy's wall before they broke his body. They would mix in delayed fuse shells, which buried themselves deep in the ground before exploding, creating earthquake-like shocks that collapsed bunkers from below. They used incendiary shells to burn away the camouflage and the oxygen. By the time the barrage lifted and the Soviet tanks attacked, the German defenders were often incapable of resistance. They were stunned, deafened, and spiritually broken. The German officers who had once sneered at the illiterate peasant gunners found that those peasants had figured out how to weaponize pure terror. The sound of the Soviet artillery was the sound of inevitable defeat. Throughout the war, German propaganda insisted that the Red Army was a tactically crude steamroller. They claimed the Soviets just threw masses of men and metal forward without sophistication. By 1945, this was a lie that the Germans told themselves to feel better. The Red Army had mastered the art of complex artillery coordination. The ultimate expression of this was the Ognivoy Val, that firewall, or double-rolling barrage. In the early days, artillery would bombard a trench line, stop, and then the infantry would attack. This gave the surviving Germans time to man their machine guns. The rolling barrage changed that. A curtain of exploding shells would move forward across the battlefield, just 100 or 200 meters ahead of the advancing Soviet tanks and infantry. The Soviet troops were trained to lean into the barrage, to stay terrifyingly close to their own exploding shells. This meant the German defenders had to stay deep in their bunkers to avoid being blown to pieces. While the Germans were cowering, the Soviet infantry was right on top of them. But the Soviets added a second layer. While the primary wall of fire moved just ahead of the troops, a second, deeper barrage would hammer the German rear areas. This second wall destroyed German reserves, headquarters, and communication lines as they tried to move up to help. It was a symphony of destruction, conducted over radios and field telephones. It required split-second timing. If the infantry moved too fast, they walked into their own fire. If they moved too slow, the Germans recovered. The fact that the primitive Red Army could execute such a complex maneuver on a massive scale shocked the German professional officers. They realized that the blunt instrument had been sharpened into a razor. The double-rolling barrage allowed the Red Army to crack the deepest, most fanatical defenses of the Third Reich right up to the gates of Berlin. May 2, 1945. Berlin. The capital of the Thousand-Year Reich was a moonscape of rubble. The sounds of battle finally faded. And in the streets of Berlin, the guns of the Red Army finally fell silent. They were parked everywhere. The light ZS-3s were aimed down the avenues. The heavy howitzers were set up in the parks. The massive B-4 sledgehammers were parked right in front of the Reichstag, their barrels still hot from blasting the final strongholds of the SS. The journey was complete. In 1941, the German generals had stood over captured Soviet guns and laughed. They saw them as junk, manned by incompetents. They had based their entire strategy on the idea that superior German training and technology would always defeat sheer mass. They were wrong. The Soviet artillery arm had learned in the hardest school imaginable. They paid for their lessons in blood during the early years. But they learned that in modern, total war, quantity has a quality all its own. They learned that if you can fire 10 shells for every one the enemy fires, you will eventually win. Stalin's ruthless focus on industrial production had created a force that no army on earth could resist. The Soviet artillery didn't just support the infantry, it conquered the terrain. It plowed the road from Stalingrad to Berlin with high explosives. As the surviving German civilians emerged from their cellars, they walked past the silent, dirty green cannons that had destroyed their world. The German strategists had mocked the god of war. But in the end, the god of war had the final word. And that word was silence over the ruins of Germany.